Today's webinar presentation is titled Exploring Silvicultural Strategies in Our Changing Forest, Eastern White Pine. Our presenter today is Bob Seymour. Bob is the Curtis Hutchins Professor of Silviculture in the School of Forest Resources at the University of Maine, where he teaches courses in silviculture, the ecology, and the management of the Acadian forest and forest stand dynamics. He holds a BS in forestry from Ohio State University and an MF and PhD from the Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies. He has over 35 years of experience in research and management of forests in the Acadian region of the northeastern North America and directs the long-term Acadian Forest Ecosystem Research Program. He has authored or co-authored over 90 publications and 5 book chapters on silvicultural subjects. He is a Society of American Foresters Fellow and has won numerous awards, including the Carl Schenck Medal for National Excellence in Forestry Education in 2014 and the David M. Smith Award given by the New England Society of American Foresters for Silvicultural Leadership in New England in 2015. We're really fortunate to have him this morning. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Bob Seymour. Bob, I'll go ahead and turn it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Kate, and welcome everybody. Thanks for tuning in this morning. I get the privilege today of talking about what one of my real loves, and that's managing white pine. I mean, I'm sure, I guess I'm better known for my expertise in work in spruce fir, Acadian forest, but this goes back even further to when I was in grad school and even when I was in high school and planted my first white pine tree. It's Maine state tree, and for the reasons that'll be evident if it's not already by the end, I have some strong opinions. There'll be a bit more research maybe than the one last month, but coming from our school forest, and we can go over that in whatever detail you like. So we should finish early, save your questions, type them in, and we'll go ahead. A little bit about the history, current status of white pine as a resource. We're going to go into some depth about a crop tree approach to pine silviculture, which sometimes goes under the heading of low density management. Its rationale and some research results. We've got some long-term studies that I think are very interesting, becoming more so. Regeneration, again, we talk about silviculture. Regeneration is the crucial feature of any system under the shelterwood method. And then we'll talk a little bit, and I encourage you to phone or write in questions about this, managing pine in sort of less conventional ways. We think of pine, in these even-age monocultures, whereas really I don't know that that's the pine of the future. That's the pine of the past. And then some about managing pests. Again, I'm not expert in that, but you can't deal with pine silviculture without dealing with the pests. Turns out that pine, if you look through the literature, there was a bibliography published in 1966 that had 944 published references, and they say they consulted over 3,000 works, right? So at that point, we knew more about white pine and researched more about white pine than probably all of our other species in New England combined. So this goes way back, and there's, of course, good reasons that we're all familiar with why that's so, because it was valuable right from the start. Obviously, it was the reason that the English we had the King's Broad Arrow policy and all of that. We all know that story. We haven't, and then it kind of languished after that to the 60s, 70s, 80s. There was a symposium down in New Hampshire, but other than a few researchers like myself in the region, there's not been a whole lot of active work going on. Partly maybe because you could argue we had a lot of this figured out back 60 years ago, but I don't think all of it, as we'll see. Let's just, before we get into the current status, it's interesting to reflect on the natural range of white pine and what it seems to have been in the Holocene, or since the last ice age. And here's a great paper 20 years ago now from my friend and colleague here on the Maine faculty, George Jacobson, who mapped from pollen records on the lakes basically throughout the Northeast and into southern Canada, the range of pine. And you can see that the pine actually reached and this is white pine, reached its peak probably 7 that many thousand years ago from the present. So, again in New England. Then it sort of gradually migrated into southern Quebec, into the Lake States. And if you fast forward to the present, or even 1,000 years ago, you see the pine range here, the distribution of white pine is way less than what it once was at its peak. And this, of course, is due to a cooling and wetter climate during this period. So when we look at in the point of George's article, and this is 20 years ago, interesting to reread this now as we still reflect on climate change, that pine could well be this, the species of the future, well adapted to a warming climate, and if that becomes drier, that is not the forecast, but if it does, then pine will be fine. Charlie Cogbill and his colleagues, Charlie especially, we all know Charlie is a New England freelance ecologist, went through all the just painstaking work for decades, looking up the pre-settlement witness trees when the towns of this portion of New England were all lotted off. And you can see this panel here is the pine, and you can see that pine was naturally concentrated in this sort of southwestern New Hampshire, southeastern New Hampshire into eastern Mass, southwestern Maine, and then over here into eastern New York. Not much right in central Vermont. That was, of course, all maple. Look at the oak down here in Connecticut. So that's where it was natural, but this was before humans had much of an impact on the landscape. And that, with respect to pine, of all species, this was huge. We all know the story from the Harvard forest dioramas, the agricultural abandonment that started around the Civil War, led to these pure pine monocultures, many of which were cut for box boards. That continued right through, probably the 1960s, before, that the fields were just pretty much all grown in, right? This has created a situation of this amazing imbalance in the size structure and age structure of the pine resource. Here it is about 5 years ago from FIA data. 81% of the land area in the white pine type in these states in New England is in the sawtimber size class. Of course, this is a good situation if you run a sawmill because there's a lot of volume out there, but it's clearly a non-sustainable structure where we have we got what, 1.4 million acres in sawtimber and 55,000 acres in seedling sapling. Clearly, that's not something that's desirable from the long-term sustainability program, and we need to devote a lot of attention to managing these older stands well, nurturing this pole timber, and then hopefully building this regeneration, which is easy to do. Now, when you're talking about pine, it's all about the management objectives, and there's sort of two contrasting approaches here that we've distilled. There's one where you're growing like high volumes of sort of just run-of-the-mill, pine, right? That's, if you just, without much management, it's not going to be all that high quality. And this would be done using a sort of a stocking guide approach, which has been around for 40-some years now. The distinct alternative is to manage pine like a hardwood, right? As an individual crop tree, release it heavily, prune it, and this is basically driven by, it's a tree level approach. It's driven by making the most dollars, not the most board feet or the cubic feet, right? So two ways. Now, if we go to our pine stocking guide, we're all familiar with our stocking guides in New England. It's about the only place where they're actually used in the world, but we're sort of stuck with them. Manage on the B line. You start up there and you bounce along like this, and you end up out there 20 inches, whatever, at the end of the rotation. And the logic of this, when these stocking guides were created by Sam Gingrich and then produced by other silviculturists, in this case Bill Leak and Phil Brook at New Hampshire, Jim Barrett, the idea was that between this B line was supposed to represent the lower limit of crown closure, and then anywhere between the B line and up to the A line, which was full stocking, maximum stocking, growth would be constant. We've, of course, seen that lots of research, Bill Leak published on this years ago, and our work has borne this out, that this is not true. It's a much more complicated situation. If you forget about that stocking guide and just think of pine as crop trees, you end up with a very different regimen, which I call low density. You prune the lower bowl. You try to keep the crown low, so you have a very high live crown ratio by the end of the rotation. That's just to avoid black knotted logs. Live red knots, right, are much more valuable in pine. So no crown recession. That's the reason why we need to really open these trees up. The final density is going to be 25 to maybe up to 40 trees per acre when your trees are 28, high 20s. So there's your lower bowl. There's the upper logs that are green, right? And so we need to keep this tree free. Such a tree, when it's 28 inches in diameter, if you do sawmill calculations and subtract out costs, you can figure you can get $1,000 if that tree's pruned worth of wholesale lumber out of it, stumpage to the landowner. I know the mills won't pay you that for it. That's another story, but the value's there. This low density stuff all started way back in the 30s, and this was a sort of a fortuitous history. Here's the Yale Forest in Keene, where I used to work as a graduate student, still under intensive management by the Yale faculty and others. Here's Hawley and Clapp putting in a pine experiment where here's the worker up there pruning the trees, 1937, all just documented. Well, what happened in 1 year after 1937? We had a catastrophic hurricane. Most of the stand was blown down, and the study was abandoned. 30 years later, my mentor, Dave Smith, was out there wandering around and noticed that, well, not all trees blew down. The ones that survived had these huge crowns. The butt logs had been pruned, and this was like a whole different kind of white pine than anybody had ever seen, right, from these typical old field stands that were overstocked and yada, yada. So Dave began to study these trees, and we'd core them and measure them, and the results were very encouraging. This was also picked up by Fred Hunt, who at that time was the Quabbin forester. He was into this. He's thinned some plantations very heavily. These are published on the reservoir, partly for just to increase water yields and other reasons. And then Alan Page, a consultant in Belchertown, Mass., really glommed onto this as a thing, as a management practice. Worked with Dave, and actually did some stem analysis. The rationale behind this, of course, is that pine, really, although it's a softwood, is actually more like a hardwood in terms of marketing. It's valuable only if it's not free and straight. Okay, clear lumber, in other words, not structural. So you need to do that because branch retention is really high or poor. We need to prune these trees, and then to get our money back on that, of course, we need to grow them rapidly afterwards. So some kind of heavy crop tree release, and then to keeping the crown low, the live crown low, to avoid these persistent black knots in the upper logs. And if you do that, you're going to have a 10% return well up into 20 inches. And even 6%, a really solid return up until the high 20s. And this is from actual trees that Dave and Alan Page sought out at Page's sawmill in Massachusetts, where they here are 3 of the hurricane-released trees. Basically, here's trees out here 20 to 24 inches worth $100 to $200. This is the residual value of the lumber after subtracting costs. Quickly, that goes when you get up in the high 20s, up to $500 and $600 trees. These are 1989 prices. The remarkable thing here is, and this, of course, counters what we hear a lot in today's markets, that we can't afford to grow a tree beyond 18 inches or whatever, is that look at this, just an exponential return. These trees, once they're 20 inches, they're really starting to grow well, right, being white pine. Now, this wouldn't be true with other species, but white pine, of course, as we know, will become enormous if you give it a lot of space. And because this is all valuable lumber now, the returns are just very high to the landowner if we can capture that in the milling process. Irving Sawmill in Dixfield on a tour a few years ago say they would like a steady run of 18-inch logs, which would be 20-inch DBH trees. Well, if you're going to feed them that, you're only growing trees that are worth a couple $100. When you've just waited another maybe 20 years, you're going to have way more valuable trees. We do that on the university forest. Here's a load we just cut this winter, 4 trees, 1,500 board feet per tree, right? And believe me, the mills love to have these. These are all, the butt logs were all pruned, and we had no problem selling these. We could have a steady diet of this stuff. So, and that's our model, is large diameter pruning, right? We've done it irregularly, but we're back on it again now. So when we design this low density schedule, what do? We select crop trees early, ideally no later than about 40 feet tall. And the live crown's about halfway up there, right, a little bit above a log. We go in and do a very unconventional, very heavy release, prevent any further crown recession, right? We're not trying to nurture the maximum productivity here in cubic volume. We're trying to get these individual crop trees to the most valuable state as quickly as possible. So that means we have to prune them, right? Usually in at least 2 or maybe 3 lifts. And for this, and you really have to do this, you have to get stocking guide out of your head, ignore basal area, forget about that, or relative density or any other stand metric, and focus strictly on the tree development, the spacing, the crown architecture. This is actually an old idea. This was based on some old data that Dave Smith had collected, including these heavily released pines and some others on the Yale Forest, which I worked on when I was a student down there in the 70s. We finally published this in '87. We came up with a new stocking guide. Now, stocking guides, of course, have basal area over trees per acre. It's just a nomogram, and then QMD lines, diameter lines that radiate from the origin. Here's your B level from the Philbrook stocking guide right here. What we found basically was because if trees that were released when they were young and kept very long, low crowns could form crown closure at densities like a third of what the stocking guide predicted. Okay, so here, just for example, a 40-foot tall pine tree at 7 inches diameter, you would need to keep 350 of those roughly to meet beeline stocking. Whereas actually, if you release those trees early, you could have those crowns would close at 100 trees per acre. 20-foot spacing, 22-foot spacing, whatever. That's a huge difference in the silviculture. I mean, so if you're stuck up here in the beeline, you're just never going to capture any of this. So this was deemed as radical when we first came out with it, but gradually, of course, now, we have a stocking guide that reflects this. We'll get to that a little bit later from the Forest Service. So, this is the first sort of peg of the scientific underpinnings of this. So look at that difference right there. And all this zone here is something that we had not been exploiting. If you were stuck on the beeline, as Rennie Germain says. So what do? You measure your crop trees, including the live crown ratio, set future thinning intervals. You're making a schedule based on the future heights of the stand and out to the end of the rotation. Then you calculate, from the equations that are in that paper in Forest Science, you can calculate the crown widths and the resulting crown area from that, square it, make a circle, figure out how many of those will fit into an acre at the future height, and then you back into a thinning, a density regime from that, okay? And you just convert that to density, from the density to spacing, so you can just apply it easily in the field. And then from that, you can then calculate the sizes of the trees and actually get a yield prediction. So that's all possible. It's been possible for 25 years now. I talk about how to do this in a little more detail in this 2000 paper in the Northern Journal of Applied Forestry if you want to actually go through this yourself and with the equations. Here's one of the things. Here's the crown radius over the crown length. And one of the things that happens is that the taller trees are actually wider for a given crown length than the shorter trees. And this needs to be kept into account. So big ones become a little bit more hogs of growing space as they get taller. But knowing this, and this is certainly a significant relationship, we can build that into our density calculation so that we're never managing at a level below, where the crowns are actually competing and then dying, the lower branches. So just an example. Here's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different heights, the sizes of the pine trees, the average pine tree at these 15-foot height intervals, basically, from starting at 35, where the DBH would be roughly 6 inches and running it out to 95. And you go through that process, and you'll get all these metrics. You'll have the crown bases at 23. There's our intervals. We looked at the next interval thing at the next height, and the crown length will be 26 feet, et cetera, 11 feet wide, and we do all this math, predict these things, and keep doing that. And eventually, we're out to, when the trees are 95 feet tall, we should have, if we do this, 25-inch trees, 31 of them per acre, based on, with huge crowns, 1,424 cubic square foot crown projection area, way bigger than you would have with a conventional beeline system, right? So so you're getting 4 to 5 inches of growth every 15 feet of height growth there. That's the way to think about it. Now, if you're on a good site, this height growth is going to happen fast. A poor site, less quickly, according to Eichhorn's rule, but you're still going to get the development. So you need a site curve to put that into time. Now, as scientists, I was very proud of all this, but it's like when it was all done, I noticed that you could simplify this tremendously using an old thinning rule, which is Wilson's spacing fraction, or the spacing height ratio, the ratio in the same units of the distance between crop trees and their average height. And what we noticed was, as soon as you start dropping below 40% of the height, then you need to keep that crown from receding. You needed to thin back to about 50% of the height. So this is a radical schedule. Half of the height of the tree should be the spacing. Anything less is not going to prevent that crown recession, and you're going to start to develop these black knotted upper logs. So that's the metric at the bottom here. If you do, again, the complicated crown expansion calculations, look at this. Wilson's fraction of 30 before thinning, 0.56, a little more, half, 5.2, 4.8, 4.7. So something around, just remember, if you want to do this, you need to open them up about half of the height of the tree. As we'll see, you can't really do this later on. You have to start this early, and then it will work. If you start too late, you're running the risk of all kinds of problems. That's the way this would look on the stocking guide. Okay, this is the new stocking guide where we have not only the old bee line, but the managed bee and the managed seed lines. So we would be out here. We thin way down below what Bill Leak has now defined as the managed C line, grow back up a little bit above it, and then keep bouncing essentially below it, up to it, right? So you're really maximizing that growing space. So the crowns are just touching right at that point. So this line here more or less corresponds to the one we showed earlier, roughly. And then you would eventually grow back up, and this, you'd have trees of that size, maybe 30 of them at the end of the rotation. So that's the way it looks, right? Just completely disregard. You're not up here in the normal stocking guide space. You're way, way down below it, and you're making way more money, probably. Growing less fiber, but making more money. We put in a study of this 25 years ago now in a 40-year-old plantation here on the Demeritt forest. I'll briefly show you some of the results from it, so just to support what I've just showed you conceptually. There are 8 reps, 10th acre plots. The trees at the beginning, so here's the control, roughly 500 trees per acre, 190 square feet of basal area, so these were very fully stocked, nothing had been done to them. B line, we took that down to about 90, this is where you'd get it. The low density treatment, we only went to 127 trees per acre. I say only, these are very open stands, 53 square feet. So, 3/4 of the stocking gone. That was actually in the density diagram that Mark Ducey did. That's a 15% stocking. The B line is 27. The unthinned controls would be about 60% relative density. If you look at the numbers relative to A line, so this is like almost 90% right on the A line, 40% of the A line, 20% of the A line, right? Trees were like this, roughly. This is the dominant crop trees, 8 inches, all the same size. Okay, crown base was too high actually. The height, the lowest whorl was up to 32 feet already because of that high stocking. 35% crown ratio. Here's the plot. Here's the low density plots after 1 thinning and 10 years of growth. These have subsequently been treated twice more. They're down to 40 trees now. This was 120. There's the canopy, not closed. Here's the B line, just what you would predict, like. Decent stocking, pretty full stocking, but not overstocked, right? So that's growing fairly decent cubic volume. There's the canopy. Here's the control. Again, unmanaged, basically, with suffering mortality and self-thinning, very tight crowns, small crowns. Here's the way those treatments look on the new stocking guide. You can see the controls are actually crashing. They're up here self-thinning, and they actually dropped in this last period. This is from work of Chris Gitterman, a grad student I had here from 2008 to 2011. Here are the B-line stands. They've been re-entered twice, and then this low density is again operating down here. This is 17 years of data. We now have 25. It would go up and come down again there. So just look at the radical difference in the densities here, both between especially the control relative to this. Just when you use conventional mensurational statistics. Rewardingly, at least, we've got now the growth rates that show that the growth rates resulting from this are not as different as the densities, okay? So here we have cubic volume growth, cubic feet per acre per year for the control, the B line, and the low density treatments, okay? So there's, 85 cubic feet to the cord. We're up at 1.2, roughly cords here, almost over 2 cords per acre in the controls. This is gross growth, not subtracting mortality. Board feet, look at that, 1,000 board feet per acre, 700. The interesting thing was in the first period, even though the basal areas were twice as high in the B-line treatment, the cubic volume growth was not statistically different. That's really interesting. It was well below the control, both of the thinnings, but the low density was not any lower than the B-line. That changed in the second period. This is why you keep these long-term studies. The B line began to creep back up in the stocking, and we rethinned the low density. So it's still down here around 100 cubic feet per acre. Decent growth rates, actually, for such a lowly stocked stand. Control's still up there, but the B line's now moved up into the middle. Same with the board feet. It's now outgrowing it statistically, okay? Again, different quality trees, though. Here's the DBH on this figure. The low density is on the top. Here's the tree volume. So you can see both in the case of the tree volumes and here, and the DBHs here, that the low density treatment is just sort of breaking away from the other two. The sad thing here for the advocates of this B-line thinning, notice here, after 17 years, I guess, the paired trees, the paired trees on the B-line plots paired with the control, same size at the beginning, right back here, are now only about an inch bigger, right? So you're not really gaining much in tree development from that sort of conventional conservative thinning. Whereas look at what we got here. We got 4 to 5 inches. We know the data are now out here. I bet they're now 6 inches bigger. We need to measure the study again. Same here with tree volume. It's pulling away exponentially as volume because that's also a function of height, right? So not that different here in the volume of the crop trees, but the low density. And this is, of course, by design. And this is coming at a cost, as we just saw, of slightly lower cubic volume and board foot volume growth rate. So it's all about the quality of that board feet, okay? That's what this is about. Now, I began to get worried about, well, these trees that are so heavily released, they probably going to have all this taper and they're going to have all kinds of defect and blah, blah, blah. You know, we hear that from mill people, others. So we measured it. We had Chris climb these trees, 17 feet, cored them, and we measured the Girard form class in all of them, both now and historically. And so here he is out here now with a bark gauge, right, measuring inside diameter at the top of in other words, the scaling diameter of the first log as a fraction of dBH. That's what the Girard form class is. You see they all started out around 77, 78. The low density, then this surprised us all, and we still don't necessarily have a full explanation for it. The low density and the control both increased up to about 82, 83. The B line actually only went to 80. So actually it's the B line, this thinning in the middle, that's generating the most taper. Now 80 is still a decent form class, right? I mean, all of these are just fine. It's not that I mean, we were afraid that the low density was going to be drifting off down like this. That's not true. That is happening up in the upper logs during the zone of the crown, but the lower log below the live crown does not. It's responding to other things, and it's distributing that increment pretty uniformly. So we're not getting any lower value or lower taper logs. If anything, they're better. So now, finally, so we can just look at the empirical results, but I was impressed like a long time ago, I guess, in my graduate education that what we're manipulating here is not basal area. We're manipulating the crowns, right? So why don't we keep track of what's coming out of the crowns in the leaf area? So I've worked in a lot of my career in developing methodology to do this accurately, and one of the ways you can do it is by collecting litter fall that falls out of the canopy. So we do this twice annually. I've been doing it on many of these thinning plots for 24 years now, 25 this spring when we took the final collection. These half square meter traps, there's 5 on a plot, you can see they're on the ground, and we collect that, dry it, and convert that, do all the expansions out to per hectare leaf area index. Now, this graph represents 24 years of that effort, right? Me out there twice a year, we're students working in the lab, sorting the needles, doing all this. So you just can't imagine how much work has gone into presenting this one figure. Here is the leaf area index, which is the surface area projected of all the needles in the pine canopy as a proportion of the ground area, in case you forget your forest ecology, right? So in other words, the control plots and all of the stands, actually, where we thinned them, had an LAI of close to 5. In other words, the area of all their foliage was 5 times that of the ground area, right? Interestingly, that's drained down or sort of dwindled. I wouldn't say dwindled, but it's like gradually declined till the point where now it's below 4. It's 3.5 in the last measurement that we had just last year. And that's predicted by some theory that's basically from crown abrasions. The trees are they're 25 feet taller now, and they're ramming into each other, and there's physically not as much room up there for branch expansion, unlike young forests that don't have that, where the leaf area goes up. Now, look at here. So the thinning, remember the drastic statistics that we had? Well, we removed, 75, 80% of the, 70% of the stocking in that low-density treatment. We only removed 60% of the leaf area, okay? So the leaf area in those stands was only 1.9. The blue is the B line. It grew back over 25 years. It dropped a little bit here when we rethinned and then grew back. Notice even after 25 years, it's not grown back to the control. That's not what's supposed to happen, right? It's supposed to come rapidly back and then we thin it again. That's really not what's going on. It's still, now it is grown back to 86%, so we should say that it is gradually recovering, but this takes a long time. Because we've re-thinned, so the low density have gone like this, we thinned them and then they've grown back again, and then we re-thinned them again. We're keeping those between leaf area 2 and 3, it looks. But that's still 62%. So we're getting, so that's why the yields of these stands are not as drastically lower as you would predict from the basal area removals. And that's a key premise. And this is what you get from doing the actual hard work, looking at what the biological process that's actually fixing the carbon. All right, so So that's reassuring. You know, we are certainly paying a price. That's the reason that these stands are producing less fiber is because they have less foliage, right? So, you know, you're not going to get the same increment between the B line and the A line because there's not as much needle area there, contrary to that early theory, which is here. Here's the growth density relationships, right, which is the key of all of this quantitative silviculture stuff. Where we have trees per acre, basal area, stocking according to the Philbrook A line, and then the DMD. Let's just look here. There's the hypothetical relationship. The idea was that growth would rise to about the A line, which in this stand was about 180 square feet, and then it would just be flat at about, what, in this case, 130 cubic feet per acre, right? That's the so-called Langsetter hypothesis that the stocking guides were built from. If you actually fit it, look what you get. It completely refutes the Langsetter hypothesis. There's just an absolute linear relationship between growth and density. So you just pick a point. You want to grow like real high vines, then keep it up around A line. If you want to grow, you sacrifice that to grow bigger trees, then just pick a point, right? It's just a trade-off, right? That's what I think all experienced foresters know. There's no plateau here. So that basically, the B line in that sense essentially becomes an irrelevant or arbitrary point along this continuum. High fiber production, as I said, we want to be up here, 200 square feet. Thin very lightly in the old Germanic style, you know, try to utilize that wood for something, and that would keep the production as high as it could possibly be, and it would fix a lot of carbon. Pine's great at that. But we wouldn't have much valuable products for a very long time versus, you know, we want maximum crop tree growth. We want to be way down here around 50 square feet of basal area or lower, right? So this is from that study. So anyway, this is illustrative, and I could present other data, you know, from other species that show this. So forget about that old idea that the growth is constant. Now, Rennie Germain over at Syracuse and his colleagues, Chris Nowak and John Wagner, this is going to be out in the Journal of Forestry maybe next month. Just published this wonderful study where this plantation, which they argue is probably the most productive stand in the state of New York, and it's hard to argue with it when you look at the numbers. It had 60,000 board feet standing. It's on a super high hardwood site. It's 100 years old, and they just did a shelterwood cut in it. Trees had all been pruned, and they generated. They ran a bunch of these trees through the mill, and they had logs. There's pictures in there of, you know, butt logs generating 18-inch wide clear boards, one after the other, coming down the green chain. So all that was good, right, and it yielded very valuable lumber. But the other point here, the not making the grade, is about all of the top logs. So the top logs, so you got your butt log here, but the top 3 or 4 top logs were all black knotted because they were managing with the old B line scenario, right from since the 1940s when they first did commercial thinnings, right till recently. So the butt logs were growing fairly well, not as well as they could have, but they were generating a lot of really low-quality wood on the top logs. So there's a lot more in the paper, but he makes the argument that, yes, pruning's certainly good, but we need to do much heavier thinning to prevent that loss, you know, and get much more of the top logs into red-knotted material. A good example here, this is in case you haven't actually reflected on this, this is a classic, this is my silviculture lecture. There you got your butt log, beautiful, perfect, pruned probably 50 years ago. That tree's 28 inches in diameter. And then you got the top logs, because of the density got high after that. One of the lowest value logs you could ever imagine. Hard to give that away to the sawmill. They're going to have to haul that down. You may get $25 to $50 a thousand for it if you're lucky, just because it's big. So that's not what we want to grow. We want live branches here. Even if they're big, they're still much more valuable. Now, if you're into density management, I could go into some length here. We've done some other work on creating another framework, and these are density management diagrams. They're sort of like the old Reineke diagrams, although we use volume instead of quadratic mean diameter, but it's trees per acre over volume over trees per acre in the log scale. And it's all built on this -3/2 self-thinning rule. So Adam Bland, a recent student of mine, went out and we got a lot of these archive data. He went out and tried to fill in the very ends of this, and look at that relationship. I mean, that is the self-thinning frontier that you fit with stochastic frontiers regression or quantile regression, which fits an upper limit to a data point, and then you fit the average, and then you have that. This becomes the average stand self-thinning trajectory, and then you're working down in here. This is a crown closure line, and you can actually, once you understand what's going on here, you can make a lot of quantitative predictions, and then you have relative density lines, and it's just a much more rigorous way to manage density. So we're in the process of publishing this, so just stay tuned on this if you're interested in. This is, of course, unfortunately, it would be nice to have this 50 years ago when there was a lot more pole-sized pine stands around to use it in, but it's I still think, a great contribution. Before we get into regeneration, let me just go one more example here from another crop tree example, which was way even more severe than the one study I just mentioned. We went from 200 square feet of basal area down to 25. So 86% removal, 94 trees per acre in one cut, 22-foot spacing, 7 inches DBH, crown ratio 42. Right now, before this is I admonish people for this all the time. Don't worry when you're doing this that the crown ratios seem low. I've heard this trees will never respond, right? The crown ratios are too small. Part of it is that you're underestimating the actual crown ratio because you can't see it well. When you actually isolate these trees, everybody, it's 25%, and we measured it, it's 42%. And it doesn't matter anyway because when the trees are 40 feet tall, in the end they're going to be 100 feet tall. If you keep that crown there, they're going to have 70% crown ratio at the end of the rotation. It does matter in very tall, spindly trees, but not in these young trees. So forget the crown ratio. Just open it up and then let them grow. A more serious thing here is the height-diameter ratio. This is a key parameter of wind firmness, right? So here we have the height-diameter ratio in the same units. In other words, just over DBH of the 470 residual trees that we left. And when I did this plot, it's like I was really concerned because Abbott's the famous German silviculturist who published on this and studied it, found that if this number is over about 75, 80, these trees are not stable mechanically, right? They could easily top over or break, and they're really at risk from wind damage. Stuff below 70 is pretty secure, and I had half of my stand here after doing this heavy thinning, at risk. So that was not good. The crown closure looked like that. But look at what happened. The leaf area here, here's the control plot that we had for that heavy thinning. We thinned that to 12%. The leaf area was only 12% of what had been there, right? The LAI was down to 0.44. Within 7 years, it's back to 57% of the control, right? An unbelievable dramatic recovery. You could just see it almost immediately. I think part of this has been studied a long time ago. These dense pine monocultures are root grafted, so they immediately usurp the root systems of the trees you've cut. So you don't want to be herbiciding these things, right? This is all done mechanically. So this is very reassuring. So we're now back up to more than half, and higher than that other stand. So this is, I did not predict that this was going to be this dramatic. This is what the stand looks like. Now, some of these trees are 5 inches bigger in 8 years, and I'm not exaggerating. We just went out and measured a few. It's just extraordinary, and they're all pruned now. Here's a sort of a gradient map of the diameter growth response, and up to the half-inch a year, the reds here, down to 0.4 inches per year from the yellow on up. And then this is a site gradient. Up here it's ledgier, so it's not got as much, but all of these trees are just growing like 10 times as fast as they were before we released them. And it's, only, what did I say? Only 10 of 470 of these trees have blown over or snapped off. And so while we were worried about that height diameter ratio, take a chance. And I figured we could lose a few anyway, and we have. Prune these up with your silky saw. You got a 4-pole silky saw. You can go up to about 20 feet. Here's Keith Canody, our forest manager, illustrating the height of the saw. So that's 17 feet one log. You can prune up to about 23. If you're going to really go up to 25 or 26, I think you need a short little step ladder. But you can do it, and that's a wonderful tool. Now you've got 2 12-foot logs. Okay, what do you do down when you get a bunch of dense pine regeneration? We've faced with this because we've been actually successful at our pine regeneration. This is actually the ideal time for release if you've got money and resources to do it, which we do have some. So we're testing 2 alternatives, and there's not a large body of literature here. We're going to do crown release on 20-foot spacing, just those trees, and leave the matrix in between untreated, or we're trying some complete removal on about a 12 to 15 foot spacing. In both cases, I think you want to leave trainers of hemlock and spruce and fir, or maybe shade-tolerant hardwoods if you're in a mixed wood situation. Just to, in fact, you even thin them too and grow them as a separate crop, so you have this stratified stand down the line. So you don't want to just make this bare ground in between. because these are not going to threaten the pine. What will threaten the pine are other pines or larger hardwoods, aspen. So just to sum up, this is the low density regime I would now recommend. Thin, you got the dense regen, pole size, something like 20 feet tall. I'd take that down to 200 to 300 trees per acre. It's 12 to 15 foot spacing. Leave the trainers, as I said. Now you can come in about 20 years, probably when they're less, if on good site, 45 feet tall, and take that down to about 100 to 120 out of 20-foot spacing. If you've done this PCT, you're going to have 10-inch trees. If you haven't done it, you're going to be like the one early example I just cited. They're going to be 6 or 7, and they're going to be fairly spindly, but they will still respond. They'll just be smaller. And you'll have to maybe do this at a break even instead of making money. If you got the 10-inch trees, you can make, calculated here, roughly $400 stumpage income. If you've done that prior PCT, discount that back to 20 years at 3%, it's $230. So you can, spend some money doing that if you want. Then you make subsequent sawlog thinnings. You have to make your money down to 60 to 70 trees, then 30 to 40 trees, probably every 20 feet in height, something like that. Again, if you really we're serious about preventing crown recession, you got to use this 50% rule, spacing height fraction. And then time this last seed year, the last cut with the seed year to secure regeneration. That's a segue into the next brief section on shelterwood. And you're going to grow them up here 26, 28, 100 feet tall. Those are going to be worth about $1,000 each. So you got a $30,000 acre if you capture all the value of that clear material on today's lumber markets. Sawmills would probably not pay you for that unless you can really document that's there. But that's another story. This also, because this low density is going to make space in the for regeneration in the understory, you need to manage that so that's pine and not red maple or beech, whatever. Another nice thing about this crop tree approach is you can work it. It works for one tree an acre if you have it. Here we are in one of our properties where there's these scattered pines growing in these beech and red maple mixed-wood stands, and it's like, why not release that? Release it just as heavy as if we're competing with other pines. Principle is exactly the same. Whereas the stocking guide approach is just useless in this situation. It doesn't do a thing for you. There's just no guidance there. So this, again, tree-level work. Don't start this as if it's over 60 feet tall. This is another one of our properties we just acquired. The basal area is up to 180. It's on a really good site. The trees, this is an almost 50-year-old stand now. Its heights are over 80 feet, so it's do the site index map. I'm not going to cut that to a 40-foot spacing. There's no way. That would just be a disaster. The trees would blow over, right? So the prescription we haven't done it, but we're looking at maybe a 60% removal down to about, about 100 trees, 110 trees per acre. Half of those are pruned. BEA would be about 70. So you can still go heavy, but I don't think you can go there. And the spacing height there would be about a quarter, not 50, right? So dial it back. I've seen at least one case where somebody tried this with a 65-foot tall stand, and it was not a good outcome. So this is not a panacea. You have to do it early. It should have been done in this stand. It just wasn't. A little bit about regeneration. Now, regeneration is really about the pine is one of the most, there's more agreement on this than anything else I know of in silvicultural literature. It's shelterwood, right? Everybody says this. It's, and right in the Lancaster League stocking silvicultural guide, cut to a 40-50% crown cover during the fall of a good seed year, right? You use logging to scarify the forest floor and eliminate undesirable understory. In our case up here, it's mostly fir and hemlock. You may have hardwoods. They may sprout, so you may have to herbicide those if you're really serious about that. And then after unless you have a very dry spring later, that you'll get pine. There's just no question if you time it with the seed year. That's the key principle that everybody goes back to. You do it other times, it's not going to work. You may get results from the next seed year, but that depends on how far that is. And pine seed years are not predictable particularly. They seem to occur every 3 years, but sometimes we skip 3 or 6, or sometimes it's 9, whatever. 10 years or so, because pine is intermediate at best in shade tolerance, we need to drop that overwood down. We want to hold it, ideally, especially if stocking's not high. Why? Because of the weevil will attack it if we release it too soon. So we keep that partially shaded, but outgrowing the competitors. So we do a partial overstory removal down to maybe 20-30% stocking, 10-15 trees per acre. And then finally, 20 years later, 15, 20 years later, we daylight it, leaving whatever reserves we might want to leave for other reasons. But if you get really dense regeneration, you can take the overwood off right here at this earlier stage, and logging-wise, that's going to work better, right? But if you don't, and you risk damaging, you need every tree, then you probably ought to wait. Here's an example where we had particularly good success, but this is not uncommon. We just do this. 2008, we had a bumper crop and 100% stocking. There's 50,000 trees per acre out there. So be careful what you wish for, because I think it's setting up a problem that we don't like. Here it is in all 3 stages. We took the overwood off, and some of it we cut it down to half after 3 years. This is an experiment. If you measure, I have a student, Emma Schultz, that's looked at the light. She took hemispherical photographs and you digitize those, and you can. Here's the distribution in her study stands. You can just plot that, and you can imagine that, of course, pines gaining the most light out here, canopy open to 70%, they're going to grow almost a meter. The ones down here in the dense shade are not growing much at all. So we've now got a model that will predict that. It also includes the height of the tree. The taller the tree, the more it will respond. So we got a nice equation here if you want to predict this, and it basically confirms what I just said earlier. An enemy can be if you don't re-enter, you may do everything right, get pine established, but if you don't re-enter and take out some of the mid-story, you need to keep that in check. So that can shade out those pines. This is 28-year-old pine regeneration, and it's spindly and on the way out of it. Here's the distribution of light in that stand, and you see the mean, the most common situation is 20% light. So we just let this one get away from us. I mean, there's pine there. Keith's going to remove some of this overstory, and we'll see what happens. But otherwise, we might have to regenerate that. When you do this really well, the stuff really grows, and it doesn't matter. Weevil has no chance. They can't weevil all those trees, and you're going to have a super overstocked pine stand, right? And that's it. That's when we took the overwood off at age 3 to take advantage of deep snow cover to try not to damage any of it, and it worked pretty well. We got not even any skitter trails through this. Does this work in other cases? Why not? I mean, you can apply these principles just like we discussed last time in gaps. Pine doesn't care, how big stand it's in. It's just one tree, so it's just competing with what's around it. If you get pine established in these tolerant conifer mixtures, it will compete quite well, even with scattered reserve trees. And you tend them just like you would hardwoods, and all the principles above just apply. We have yet to do this in our gap experiments, but we're going to start that this summer. We'll see. Now, finally, I can't stop without showing you this work. This is really encouraging. This is, is there any hope finding weevil-resistant pine? I think so. Mike Greenwood and I got a grant like 8 years ago now where using a stock that's generated by J.D. Irving in Canada via somatic embryogenesis, where you make a culture out of seed and then you can produce plants out of this. So they're all clones, right? And so we planted out 64 different clones in 10 blocks, replicated. This is what it looked like after 2 years. We brush blanketed the trees. Mike is a geneticist. I did the silviculture, so we made a good pair here. Here it is at age 8. And if you look out through that stand, I mean, that's not just a bunch of cabbage pines. There's some really excellent formed trees there now that they're 12 to 15 foot tall. This is on a super good soil, grassy sod. We collected weevils 2 summers ago, released them on the leaders of the best trees, and have been following this. And there's clearly, here it is at age 4. Here's Cliff Foster, pine expert in Maine, and Scott Pease, a log buyer for Hancock. Overjoyed seeing this great weevil-free pine sapling over their head. Here's at age 5. Look at that. I mean, that's just amazing. It's growing by itself, right? There's plenty of weevil out there. Here's a picture I just took last week. The trees are actually taller. Appears that they're pitching them out. If you look at the leaders, I mean, they're being attacked, and for whatever reason, the pitch is knocking those adult weevils out. Finally, one slide on managing pests. I just was at the NESAF meeting last week and was reminded of this by a panel down there. Weevil is easy to manage unless you're starting with an old field. That's when you need this weevil-resistant stock. But if you just apply shelterwood, keep the trees in the light shade, you can get almost as much height growth. What the weevil wants is the fat diameters. So you get the high growth without the fat diameters, and off you go. You'll have no problem with weevil. Blister rust, I think in the West, it's other places. In northern Maine, it's a big problem. But most of civilized New England, where people live, there's been this effective eradication of rabies. We've slacked off on that in recent decades, but I mean, there was such a good legacy of it that it's hard to find much of it out there. So it's a nuisance. It will certainly get some of your trees, but it's not lethal to the point where it's going to really impact your system. The nastier one is this needle casts that have come in. It began in 2009, apparently, from that incredibly wet year. That same wet summer that gave us all 100% germination of those pine seeds that we brag about now, also gave us this needle cast. Now, this is worse in parts of Maine than others. The states have been mapping it, and it's potentially scary if it ends up like the Swiss needle cast in the West Coast, where they planted Douglas fir out of its range and becomes chronic. It basically attacks the older cohort of needles. They fall off, so they're not there to conduct photosynthesis for a whole growing season. So the tree's running on half of its foliar capacity, right? And that's just, if there's no out of that, then that's a serious problem. And then finally we have this sort of nuisance canker. That's what I call it, at least. You see it on the trees. It creates these little pitchy bleeding spots in between the whorl, so it's not blister rust. Most of them get healed over, and they're mid-bowl of immature trees. It doesn't develop on thick bark or in the upper trees. I guess it does develop on regeneration, but people are studying how much of a defect is in lumber, but I don't see much of a problem with it here. I think I'm done. Yeah, so ran a little longer than I wanted to, but we still have, 8 minutes for questions or so, so fire away.
Great. Thank you so much, Bob. And we do have a few minutes for questions. So there are some questions that have already been sent in, so I'll start off with those.
Good.
A question from David. I'm interested in the possibility of enhancement plantings of white pine in degraded beech-dominated stands in central Maine. Any thoughts or suggestions?
That's a great idea, and I would certainly do that. And if we could get stock from Irving that we knew was genetically resistant to the weevil, then that would be all the better. But I think I would still go ahead and plant. In fact, we're doing it ourselves on our own land, and I would do it, at a density of 100 per acre. Use the best stock you can buy, 3.0 or even transplants, so they'll be competitive. I like the brush blankets. If you're doing it as on your own sort of hobby woodlot where you're only going to plant a few hundred trees, then you can do that effectively. If you're managing a bigger operation, that would get tedious and expensive. It probably costs $4 a tree to use those. So they're not cheap, but they make sure the tree gets off to a great start in the competition, and I think that's a great thing. You obviously have to kill or cut back the beech so it's not going to overwhelm the pine, but once the pine's above the beech, it's off to go. So good idea.
Great, thanks, Bob. And a question from Wayne about sun scald. Any thoughts on sun scald? I don't.
For these heavy thinnings, we've not seen one bit of sun scald in these trees, thinned at age 40. I have seen sun scald on younger trees in 20, not from our thinnings here, but from some widely spaced plantations that just got hit. And I can't say, I don't want to diminish the importance of it because I know people always ask me about it, but I don't think it's a serious impediment to this low density thinning done in the sort of early pole stage. So no.
Great, thanks. And a question from Kirby. You were just talking about the weevil damage. I guess the question is there more weevil damage in low-density stands?
If there is, it's up at a part of the tree that doesn't really matter. I think the weevil will attack. I think this is a misconception. We think of weevil just attacking saplings, but weevil will attack up in the tops of the trees, and I think it probably does impinge height growth some. But when we measure our heights, I guess all I can say, Kirby, is that there doesn't seem, it's hard to see weevil that far up, obviously. But when we measure the heights, if that was true, the heights of the low density stands would gradually become lower, less than the controls or the beeline, and that's not what's happening. If anything, it's the other way around, because the trees are so vigorous, they're actually growing more in height. So if weevil is a problem, it's not a huge problem. And you're talking about trees now that are 70 feet up, and 80% of the value in that tree is below that point.
Great, thanks, Bob. Another question from Eben. What about pine leaf adelgid?
Oh, the pine leaf adelgid. That's I left that out. This is a bug that was severe in the 1960s. It was studied by John Diamond. Some of you older foresters in Maine remember John. I worked with John early in his career as forest entomologist. it alternates between red spruce and white pine, and it apparently doesn't do anything to the red spruce. So you get this pine where you have those mixtures, like Eben does up in the park, and down eastern Maine especially is full of these things. That's where the previous outbreaks were worst. It can cause serious top kill to white pine trees when it gets severe, I'm told. Now, I've not seen it. We've seen the recent little outbreaks of it around, and it's causing browning, loss of foliage. It's an adelgid, so it's a sap-sucking insect. So if you have, but I can see also the relic damage from it in pines that were attacked in the 50s and 60s. Both in it looks like a giant weevil fork, actually. And you think about it, well, there's a dead top up there that's 12 inches, and it's, oh, the weevil got it. Well, I don't think that, as far as I know, we don't have any weevils that are killing 12-inch leaders. This was the pine adelgid. And so you get this kind of big slingshot top, and I imagine that's what those are. Marianne Faven's doctor work, when we cored all of these old pines down in what was then the Champion St. Regis land, every single one of them showed a huge growth reduction in the radial increment for about 4 years from that, but they all recovered. Now, at least the ones that we cored, of course, recovered. I think there was some salvage cutting that went on then over down east. I'm told, I was, of course, not here then, in the 60s, to capture some of those really badly diseased pines. So it can look bad, like budworm can look bad for a while on spruce, but then the pines recover, apparently, for reasons that who knows, I don't know. Good question.
Great. Thanks, Bob. A couple more questions for you. Here's one from David. What are the implications of low density thinning for the next generation of pines? Do you see this approach initiating new cohorts like the shelterwood method that can be carried through, or do you anticipate issues related to the length of time the crop trees are being retained?
I think to me it's if you're worried about retaining the crop trees, I think you retaining them. If you compare it to a conventional shelterwood system, I think with the low density, you have them, because they're growing faster to a target size, you're holding on to them for less time. It's essentially it's a fast motion or a fast forward of the sort of old-fashioned beeline shelterwood, where you wouldn't even start until the trees were 100 and some years old. Here you're doing it when they're probably 50 or 60, right? So. And the trees are just bigger. Of course, they're going to be bearing more seeds. That's another. I didn't say that, but obviously these big crown trees are going to have plenty of seed production. So I think it's the classic. If we have these pine monocultures and we want to keep them, like we're trying to do here, not completely pure stands. We like to have the hemlock in them and the other hardwoods occasionally. But the pine's where the money is. We're trying to do that on probably a 70 to 80 year rotation now. Whereas the old stuff that we're logging, the stuff that was on the truck it's probably 120, right? Because that was managed very conservatively when it was young by my predecessors. I'm not sure that answers the question, but that
there's a sort of a follow-up piece that might help you a little bit, Bob. Relatedly, is there any potential for these to become two-age stands?
Oh, so that, of course, anything can become a two-age stand if you just retain some of the crop trees, right? Instead of harvesting them all. And I think about this some when we're out in these stands. When you do a conventional shelterwood, like when you really want to thin that from below, when you do the establishment cutting, save all of your big trees, even if some of them are fairly rough. And then when you come back with that partial removal to daylight the regeneration, you don't need those big trees anymore. You can harvest them and then leave the smaller ones. You may have all these nice, really tall, fairly skinny, but really well formed, like 16-inch sawlog trees. I would just leave them into the next rotation. They will definitely grow. There's research from the Pack Forest in New York and other places that show that those trees will grow well for a very long time. So you could definitely leave them, and that would then give you that residual structure, the 2H structure that you wanted to carry for a long time. That would be there for a long time because you'd be 40 more years once you did that overstory removal before you'd be back after them, along with the thinning and the young cohort. But I would, encourage that approach, and I think we are probably phasing into doing some of that. We don't cut the last of the overstory here. Yeah.
Great, thanks, Bob. Just trying to squeeze in a few more questions here. There's a question from Patrick on the costs of pruning per year.
The cost of pruning, I think of it as per tree. I think the best time study done was by Kevin O'Hara It probably costs, if you prune right from the ground to 17 feet, paying skilled workers, what, $15 an hour, something like this. This was done in the West, where they pruned 4 different Western conifers. It was published in the Western Journal. You can prune about 4 trees an hour that way. So, that costs maybe $5 a tree to prune a tree fully up. If if you're just doing lifts, of course, that's going to take less time. So, that's not cheap. If you're doing 100 trees per acre, that's $500. And here in Maine, NRCS has stopped cost sharing that practice, sadly. I'm told. I haven't actually tried to apply for any of the money, but that's what I heard. But I still think it's worth it. If you think about, if you got pine that's worth $1 a board, $1,000 a thousand, versus pine that's worth what, 150 a thousand now? No, not even that. It's 120 stumpage that we just got. It's for pruning for a $500 investment. That looks pretty good compounded out there, even 40 or 50 years. So something like that. I don't know. I don't know if there's any contract pruners around in the business. There's a bunch of course, tree planters and pre-commercial thinners. Whether they'll prune, I don't know.
Sure.
You should do more of it for sure.
Thanks, Bob. Another question for you from Jim. What do you think of allowing pole-sized trees to come along in the older low-density stands to get the next crop coming along?
That works fine. I'm not sure I pictured the question, but I think I know. These would be trees that wouldn't necessarily be ideal crop trees, probably, because they're overtopped or the crowns are not well formed. But I think, again, it's like I said last month about the spruce. The current crown form of trees that are relatively short, as long as they have some crown, maybe 25% sapling stage, small poles, they will respond. White pine, I think, is underrated in its ability to respond to release, and I would definitely favor those trees. What else do you have? It's better than trying to plant a pine at that same spot. And that pine's probably not going to compete with anything. And, if it's already straight for 30 feet or whatever, you don't have to worry about the weevil. So I definitely do it. And I have been doing it on our own property and on the Demeritt forest. We do it routinely. Pick out any pine. Any crop tree you got out there, 5 to the acre, release them. And usually you can do that by cutting a bunch of hardwood pulpwood or maybe some bigger pines, hemlocks in our case. Yeah, do it.
Great. Thanks, Bob. And one last question for you from Mike. Have the needle casts confounded your LAI measurements in recent years?
They have not here because it hasn't hit our plots, and very fortunately, as far as I know. I mean, the needle cast is obvious because you go out there in June, right, and the needles are starting to fall off instead of October when they normally do, the second year needles. And I've seen it happen over in western Maine. It's just awful. I mean, they just come pouring down in June. So here we don't. I just talked to Bill Livingston, our pathologist, and he says he has seen it various places, but not really on the university forest. I'm not sure why. I don't think. Probably growing these trees under open conditions is probably helpful, like any fungal disease, right? The more you air it out, the less the fungal activity will develop. But I'm not sure if that happens in foliage, though. That's more like bolls. I don't know. I'm going to be alert to it. Now, if I see it, I'm going to have to. What I'll do is I'll monitor the litter fall more than twice a year. I'll have to collect it like monthly over the summer, and we could then quantify what's being lost. And then, of course, we're measuring the trees, so we could see what was lost in the growth. But luckily, we've not had it hit us, though, and I hope it doesn't.
We'll keep our fingers crossed. Well, thank you so much,
yes,
Bob.
Okay.
We appreciate your time this morning, and thank you everybody for tuning in. Just a couple of quick reminders before we let you go this morning. As I mentioned in the introduction, there is a survey for you to complete at the end of the webinar. Please take a few minutes to give us some feedback. And then lastly, just wanted to remind folks that the Silvicultural series continues next month. We'll be joined by Laura Kenefek with U.S. Forest Service, who will be giving us a presentation on eastern hemlock and northern white cedar. So the next webinar is scheduled for April 21st. Again, same time, 9:30 to 10:30. Please tune in then. And thank you again, everybody, for participating today. Thank you, Bob, and have a great day, all. Thank you.
Thank you.